Hey everybody, how you guys doing? Hope you guys are doing good. Well, hopefully you're good and bad, or else you're dead. Yes? Speaking of ancient dead people, today we're gonna rant and rave, do a little song and dance here, about the Greek poets and epics, the cultural background of Greek philosophy, for the Greek philosophy class. I'm Eric Gerlach. I'm doing this lecture for Berkeley City College while we're all indoors during the pandemic. And again, there's construction outside, and thank you for your continued patience with all of this. As with the Buddhist philosophy class this semester, we're going to start cranking out the videos, and they're a little bit overdue. So, yes. So, to get back into the subject here, any class on Greek philosophy should probably fill in some of the cultural background. Not only is it important to talk about, so who are the Greeks and who identifies with the Greeks and why, because white identity, white people saying like myself, well, we're white, therefore we're Greek. Well, I'm somebody to rant and rave about how Catholics liked being Roman and also kind of were increasingly inspired by the Greeks. You can see the Vatican started collecting books in Greek, specifically around the 1400s and 1500s. That's as white people started getting power and money. They didn't call themselves white people yet. They're the Catholic Church and Christendom, according to them. And they started getting really into Greek stuff, and then a bunch of stuff turned Protestant, and Protestants and Catholics started fighting each other all around the world with European types. And in this, a bunch of people have said that they are Greek, and they are white, and they are Western. And you can watch my other videos very much about calling all that into question. So if we are going to say, well, the Greeks are maybe not British people, and British people don't actually let a bunch of Greek people immigrate while also copying a lot of Greek culture, then cultural background and all of these things is good, and it helps understand how all these people are human. I am a big fan of saying, hey, Indian, Greek, Chinese philosophy, all of it teaches more about being human, and so we don't have to be Western necessarily or be Greek or think Greek is Western, but we are in modern times. People identify with the Greeks a lot. Recently, they have started saying, well, the Greeks are the ones who invented science rather than the Egyptians or Persians or Babylonians, and the best way of tackling all of that is actually to say, well, we've lost some of what the Babylonians and Egyptians have done, but I can fill in the culture of the Greeks such that they look like a human culture, a couple of them, and it's interesting. So part of that is filling in the background of the poets and the epics. The Greeks did share a culture and a family language, so they did know that they were Greek people in various terms, and people did refer to them by various terms as Greek people. But they were also a loose affiliation of culture, like a lot of tribes, tribes of tribes, etc. And it was really only when Homer, yes, not of The Simpsons, and also Hesiod, the two epic Greek ancient poets who wrote the Greek epics, which were oral traditions. We're just going over with the Indian Buddhist philosophy class that the Rig Veda and the Vedas were originally oral traditions that are somewhat philosophical, that are ancient epics about gods. The Vedas of India are very comparable, however you want to pronunciate that, to the Homer and Hesiod epic poems, and then as they got written down, and we think, people believe that Homer and Hesiod, the Odyssey, etc., were written down at least by 700 BCE. So 700 years previous to the switchover of, again, around the mid 0.10, whichever way it goes, outs a ways. 700 years back before Jesus had a pair of sandals. Supposedly the oral traditions of Homer and Hesiod were written down for the Greeks. And the Greeks knew that they were not the only culture on Earth, as they detail in those epics, etc. So Homer is said to be, by most ancient sources, have been an Ionian, but by some to have actually been a Babylonian. Think about how Abraham also supposedly came from Ur, and all of that. Again, the ancient Israelites and ancient Greeks do come from the central Middle East area, which of course they would, regardless of ethnicity. of many ethnicities in that area. Homer, again, for whom the Simpsons character is named, for Matt Groening's father, I believe, who was named for the Simpsons character Matt Groening later came up with, we know, is the great original Greek poet historian. He's followed by Hesiod. Some people think that Hesiod is sort of copying and imitating Homer. So basically, he is a somewhat imitator and is doing work like Homer. But that is up to interpretation. Homer wrote the Iliad, the story of Achilles and the Trojan War, and the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus or Ulysses' 10-year quest to sail home from the Trojan War. Myths are not monolithic. They're subject to various telling interpretation. Many stories are sort of acts of getting people's interpretations and culture together so that you can see many different interpretations and perspectives being wrestled together into ancient epics and cultures. So Homer and Hesiod, what they are doing, like the Vedas of India, is they're actually bringing together several different tales, probably conflicting in many ways, of gods, the origin of the world, fire, things like that. And they are bringing together, like with the Vedas, they're bringing together many different stories that are epic stories, and then they are telling the best version of those stories, and then they are the ones who told the best, most memorable versions, as far as we know, because nothing is written down, we don't have receipts, as before there is the things being written down as texts and literacy and all of that. So essentially, they are the ones bringing together Greek language literacy with their culture. They are the major texts and authors as Greek is becoming a literate language in imitation of other cultures like Egypt, Sumer, etc., such that Greek writing becomes a thing. It very much like in Croatia. Croatian was written down for the first time in a beautiful Cyrillic-like script in the Middle Ages in order to translate the Bible. Tibetan became a written language with symbols in order to translate Buddhist texts into Tibetan. There was no written Tibetan before there were Buddhist texts in Tibetan. Similarly, Greek as a written language very much came into being with Homer and Hesiod. They were around at the time. They weren't the first people to be literate, or in fact, of course, they likely, possibly, were not. But yeah. It's hard to say. But they came up with rhyming songs, so possibly not, and then others wrote those things down after them. Again, we don't have the receipts, it's hard to know. We don't have the pictures and the photographs and the video record of all of that. So all of this is, again, pretty typical of human cultures. And the epics are similar to the Ramayana and Mahabharata and and the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. One of the wonderful things about learning about India, Greece, the ancient Israelites, China, is that they really show you the pieces of human culture. They show you a lot of what America's doing, China's doing today, and cultures having done that thousands of years ago. It's just that simple. And still that stupid, of course. Yeah. Homer's Iliad supposedly takes place during the Trojan War. It famously begins after Paris, not the city, kidnaps Helen and takes her to Troy. Oddly enough, Alexander was the first time the Greeks were unified very briefly, because Alexander himself was decently brief, less than 3 decades, I think, that Alexander's empire kind of split up, somewhat like the Islamic world. It was majorly unified as a very quickly split up thing. And so the Greeks actually did not have they were unified against the Persians, of course, the Battle of Marathon and all of that. But they actually very much were unified politically by Alexander, and then only temporarily. So in fact, the writing and the language was a unifying culture, and then the language developed into a literate language. And then Alexander came along and said, "You're all related to my grandfather, King Helen. And he is by the way, you all have stories about King Helen. He is my Helen the man." And so, yeah, oddly enough, Helen of Troy, a different Helen, possibly named for older Helen, which was a guy's name, or also, I suppose, both here, that Paris supposedly kidnaps Helen, or Helen has Paris abduct her, and they both together go to Troy, prompting a war with the Greek alliance at the time, which was the loose political affiliation of the cultures, which was at odds with itself. In fact, Greece was not so much of a unified entity as much as, like a lot of cultures in Europe, it was allying with Persia, Egypt in different ways, different groups of the Greeks. So the Spartans and Athenians did not all get along all at the same time. I have heard people say, for instance, it's like the Greeks were a democratic culture. Well, Athens was democratic for a time, and they democratically elect the Pope amongst archbishops, but these are somewhat situational things, and no, Greece was not in general democratic. Like, that's very much what we say about them to sort of celebrate the Greeks as ours or something rather than Muslims, but it again is not that all of this was democratic or that the Athenians got along with the Spartans. Like, that's just, it's more complicated, of course, as it is today, you know. So yes, essentially, the Iliad begins after this kidnapping as the Greek king Agamemnon, scoring points, refuses to return the daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo he has captured as a slave. In response, Apollo sends a plague. And Apollo was originally a local god of shepherds and musicians. He became, as he developed, into the Greek god of light, the sun, truth, and music, which you can see is an earlier herder's god becoming more civilized very much, along with Egyptian gods and other gods and goddesses who develop in those ways. Apollo's son, Asclepius, a famous god for philosophers, Greece became the god of mystical knowledge and wisdom. Philosophy is love of wisdom in the Greek, or wisdom love. It's a little run together terms ambiguous, like a lot of words. And so Asclepius is the god of wisdom and Apollo's son. The son of light and truth is wisdom. The last thing Socrates, one of the most important moments of Asclepius in Greek philosophy is the last thing Socrates supposedly says, according to Plato, is that he tells someone, please sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius for me, which suggests symbolically that Socrates in death is being cured of a disease, that one sacrifices a chicken to Asclepius, which is, again, animal sacrifice to polytheistic gods, yeah, straight up. That's basically do animal sacrifice to polytheistic gods because I have been cured of a disease as if I had boils, and now and I pray to the god, and now I don't have them anymore. We still have the snakes twirling up the staff in medicine, which is actually Europeans then pretending to be Greek in a later state of the game. It's not actually people being consistently Greek, all of that throughout culture up to modern times, but in Europeans sort of embracing Greek culture and sort of crowning themselves somewhat culturally with Greek culture and saying, oh, we British people are so Greek that we have hospitals that have the staff and the snakes up it. That's from Asclepius, again, polytheistic animal sacrifice healing, and all of that, which then accompanies the cross and other things, even in secular times. When say we're not Greek Orthodox. In fact, none of the Protestants are Greek Orthodox, which is a wonderful point to keep bringing up. Everybody wants to be Christian and Greek. Okay, we can all join Greek Orthodoxy together, and so can the Catholic Church, and then we'll all have unified Greek philosophical Christianity, which is what the Greek Orthodox Church has always said they are, and then, yes, it's interesting, again, culturally, because a lot of people want to be the Greeks, and the Greek Orthodox are like, we are Greek philosophy and Christianity, we're right here, New Testament's in Greek. Many people who believe science is Greek or that Protestantism is somehow Greek, they don't think of the Greek Orthodox or how rational they are or care, And of course, I mean, humans are humans here. It's nuts. It's how all of perspective kind of shows you a lot of this stuff. But anyway, back to the story at hand. So Odysseus, the protagonist of Homer's Odyssey, basically brings the priest's daughter back to Troy. He prompts a disagreement between Achilles and Agamemnon, and Achilles, refusing to fight, allows the Trojans to gain the upper hand, prompting the great Greek gods to interfere with the conflict on all sides. So in polytheism also, you find that the powers that be are warring forces of nature, which is like society, which is like nature. You find this, of course, it is true still today that the powers that be are warring forces in the economy, in politics. You find, as the Greeks themselves are a wonderful example of, because as I was ranting and raving, they are very much connected to Europeans through Christianity, actually, primarily. And that is me not being a non-religious person. I'm not suggesting that so we can gain Christian identity. But the Greeks are connected to the Romans and then to the Europeans, at least, in certain ways by way of culture and religion and Christianity. And then people started crowning them as the originators of science more recently as Europe came up in the world and Protestants started getting fantastically successful. Between 1600 and 1700, Europeans passed up the Islamic world economically. That's very recently, along with, and then that's as the colonialism is happening, as the slave trade. We have Islam doing good and bad in the world, a lot of empire. We have then Europeans doing the slave trade and science, a lot of good and bad in the world, like Islamic stuff. Is there Islamic science, Western science? What's the scientific method difference there? I've never heard it. People are doing technology and stuff. They're doing latest practices. They're doing increasing experimentation in the Islamic world. And then again, all of this flowers outwards into people, yes, saying, identifying with these very texts and all of that. So basically, Achilles is in the fight here. Odysseus brings the priest's daughter back to Troy. And Achilles refuses to fight, and he allows the Trojans to gain the upper hand. Gain the upper hand, prompting the great Greek gods to interfere, and they are polytheistic, so they're actually on all sides. You find with monotheism, which is what I was somewhat ranting about, the Greeks go from being polytheistic to being more so monotheistic and Greek Orthodox and stuff. Like you find in cultures of the world, polytheism and monotheism is very much there is one order, powers that be. Whether or not there are many or one order to things is something obviously people are still dealing with, whether we like it or don't like it or what's happening. And people were wrestling with those forces back in the day. So Heraclitus actually says all of this is lies because the polytheistic gods are more like a monotheistic force. Heraclitus is my favorite Greek philosopher. He can be said to be not only teaching people subjectivism and relativism, but also that he likes polytheism, but he speaks about polytheism very monotheistically. He's a major source for Stoics and then later Stoic Christians and Christianity and such. And Heraclitus basically says gods are not bloodthirsty. Homer and Hesiod are liars. Polytheists like Homer and Hesiod think the powers that be in the corporations are all at war with each other. Nope, there's objectivity of science. There's purity. Like, there's just the pure mind state. And it would not be bloodthirsty. Like, if you think about it, is the objectivity of science corporate battles or laboratory, like, intersquabbling? Or is it at peace with itself and the calm objectivity of science? I gotta say, criticizing the psychology evenly across human beings, it's like, no, there's calm objectivity, and then there's also the warring powers that be. Whether or not you're a polytheist, I don't teach many polytheists. I do, though, occasionally. There's people from all around the world here in Berkeley and come to Berkeley City College. Not right now, though. Maybe never again, given the current conditions. But yeah, with everybody phoning it in online right now, plenty, is that, yeah, essentially all of these are things that we are, again, plenty still wrestling with. So, the Greeks are a wonderful thing here with polytheism in the epics to talk about how societies are struggling to have one and many altogether, and how polytheism is wrestled into something like an overall plan, which then increasingly in civilizations imitating Egypt and the Zoroastrians of Persia, which Heraclitus was from that part of the world, and that part of ancient Greece from the Turkish modern half, from the ancient half that became the modern Turkey, that yes, wrestling with monotheism versus polytheism, if there is one plan and one consciousness versus many different warring forces and plans, is still subjectivity versus objectivity, a lot, for everyone. And it is a wonderful thing to study, thus, the ancient world. So Hesiod's theogony, we are just barely covering, of course, the basics in all of this. There's all kinds of ins and outs, but I am only covering the most basic frames of each of these things in order to just give us the basics of the culture, and then there's class upon class one can take on the Odyssey, etc. Of course, there's a whole book about Ulysses, although I think that's Irish. Anywho's, Hesiod's theogony, one of them things. It is wonderful to try to pronounce these words, pronounce them like American or British academics, and then, of course, have no idea how the Greek words were actually pronounced at all. It's like there's some guy named Aristoteles at some point in one of Plato's dialogues. It's like, is it Aristoteles? Probably not. Is it two Aristotles? I don't think so. The theogony is an account of the origin of the world and the gods, speaking of polytheism and monotheism. It's bringing together various myths and versions to create an orthodox account. The text has Eastern influences from earlier Babylonian and Assyrian mythology and cosmology. As Hesiod explains, the gods are born, but they do not die, or if they die, they are reborn and live in spite of death. The gods can take many forms, such as animals or particular human individuals, but they have a true form which is anthropomorphic, or at least it cares in some kind of way and is human interactive. While we use the word epiphany to mean some sort of revelation. An epiphany would be the revealing of a god in a true form to the Greeks, as is the famous story of Zeus revealing himself to a woman, and because she is tricked by a goddess into Zeus revealing himself, and then he reveals more than he normally reveals to mortal women and everything else that moves. And yes, she is blown away completely and vaporized by Zeus's pure awesomeness because, yes, his unconcealed form is beyond mortal comprehension. It's also what Heraclitus says about the gods. Heraclitus believes there are gods, but they are beyond anthropomorphic, and they are beyond our comprehension. But in a good way, and he believes in the harmony of it, unlike Lovecraft kind of suggesting Cthulhu kind of floats by and doesn't give a crap, which is more Epicurus, as we'll talk about, who thinks there are gods, but does not believe the gods care, which is why he thinks the world is the way it is. So yes, all of these people, notice, believe in many gods, and they all have wildly different philosophies about what their being many gods actually mean in ways. So Hesiod says something that is a very particular philosophical problem, and this is brought up in Indian and Greek logic and argumentation and philosophy in various ways. Very much like the Buddhist, what is the sound of one hand clapping, which sound is impermanent. If my hands and myself are caused by my parents, then am I going to die one day? And if that's true, then if anything is mortal, if anything is immortal, then in a certain sense, later philosophers are going to say, and this is an issue you find in Chinese, Greek, and Indian philosophy, technically there are accounts in each of these cultures that gods are born, and then there are major theological problems in polytheism and then in monotheism, and one can even ask, so was the pure mind state of objective science, was that in Inuit and in the Aboriginal people, or did that arrive at some point now we're purely unbiased, by way of history or time? Because as soon as it arrives by way of history or time, it's like, then how did it become pure or timeless? And there's an interesting way where, even if I start talking smack about, say, objectivity in the name of science, art, the West, anything like that, it's like, when did the objectivity, when did the purity come about? There's a way where if something is never going to die because it's absolutely pure, then technically it should never have been born. Because, of course, in a certain way, as many philosophers will subtly but argue pointedly here, if something was born, then technically it should die. This is a problem. In fact, even if you listen to the Catholic Mass, I'm not sure what it is actually at the very present time, because I'm not an actively religious person. But it is true that the Catholic Church has had people specifically say begotten, not made. And as I point out in different places, that actually means that Jesus was somehow born outside of time, such that this all does not apply to Jesus, technically. And that's, if that sounds crazy to bring in, that's because actually these are Jesuits and other theologians earlier, much earlier than Jesuits, who are arguing about whether or not Jesus could be born and thus be eternal, a la God, or it's some kind of mystery. These things are, Hesiod is saying the gods are born, but he then says they do not die. That is a major, Heraclitus calls Hesiod a fool, specifically for this as one of the early major Greek philosophers. If something is born, it can die. The gods are born and dying, or forever cycling through the cosmos, according to Heraclitus, like water and fire. They would not, therefore they're continuously dying and being reborn, according to Heraclitus. So he tries to solve the problem that the gods are born and die, and are either born, getting birthed and dying all the time, or are continuously being born and dying as they are. So that would solve the problem for Heraclitus. It is in the begotten, not made theology of the Catholic Church. And I would even say, if somebody believes, well, humanity was biased and then we reached an unbiased state in any culture, Christianity or science or anything like that, when there's a problem mentally, it's like, but if we got to the pure, truly human at a point, why wasn't it there all along? It's actually a very interesting psychological problem that bleeds over into ethics, logic, everything. Like, it involves a lot of stuff. There are very major problems like this of mind, which are incredible to look at in ancient thought, because we don't simply know how we do science or politics. We just say it is objective or subjective, and then people argue endlessly about it, as I do like to do. So there's lots of ways where people will stop and say, well, something's subjective or objective, but they won't really get into how your taste buds work with ice cream or how politics actually works. A lot of times it's just, it is the way it is, the way it is. And yes, my mother and her siblings supposedly used to sing a song to annoy their parents, saying, we're here because we're here because we're here, and driving in the car, we're here because we're here because we're here. And it's like, yes, in the Vedas, I believe it's the Upanishads actually, In the Upanishads, it says in the Indian tradition, all creatures on earth run around trying to be, not realizing they already are. So Hesiod's cosmology is, again, actually trying to argue that about the forces that always are and are permanent and how they were born, which, again, this gets him called an idiot by some major philosophers in Greece early on. So Hesiod says that creation unfolds in stages. He's probably inspired by series of empires conquering and then reconquering the same land. For Hesiod, first chaos gives birth to darkness and night, and from these come ether, bright upper air, supposed to be a separate element by the ancient Greeks, Buddhists, and Isaac Newton, and then also day. So you see, of course, light and darkness being separated and into very specific kinds of light and darkness. This is early proto-chemistry, and this is very resembling of Egyptian cosmology at the time that was earlier, as well as contemporary. The Greeks are doing, in certain ways, what they believe the Zoroastrians and the Egyptians did earlier, according to Plato, and they are trying to, in a certain sense, Hesiod is trying to figure out the forces of fire and water and heat and cool. And these things will be debated by other thinkers as they were in Egypt. And then sometimes, again, with the Milesians we'll get next, the Greeks get credit for being the first scientists for saying things like this, which honestly are kind of transcultural as people start to get more and more literacy and start to try to figure this stuff down on paper. So Uranus, also Uranus, yes, insert your jokes here, god of the sky, gets it on with Gaia, a nice male-female pairing. Before, again, people were literate or mathematical. In fact, peasants have been highly illiterate and mathematical, unmathematical. Again, Siberian peasants say, well, 7 plus 2 is what if it's cats, because I can't get them all in a wheelbarrow. There's not really steady arithmetic for most peasants most of their existence, and thus most of humanity. It would be male and female pairings that family structures, polytheism, parents that structure the universe. Now we're foolish enough to believe it's literacy and math that structure the universe, but that would be what nobles think, of course. Literate people. People who have control of peasants who are illiterate. The peasants would not think the world is mathematical. They don't do math. And why would they think? They would think it's sexual or something like it's mother and father. So basically, and here again, I'm not a psychoanalyst. I don't think it has to be mother and dad. It's just like it's math if it ain't that, to people, because it's any damn thing. So basically, anything that's useful anyway, and sex and math are both useful so far, at least still. Basically, Gaia and Uranus get it on, and they produce the Titans, who famously are overthrown by Zeus. The head Titan, Kronos, the god of time, castrates Uranus and assumes his place as king father god. On New Year's Day, European cultures present the ending the year as an old man in a toga with a scythe, and many have said that does look like it's sort of Kronos. And again, he's a little bit snippy. And yes, so Kronos has children with the Titan Rhea, but then he eats them as soon as they're born, famously in that Goya painting. And all except Zeus, who escapes with the help of Rhea and Gaia. And Zeus produces the other Olympic gods as his children in a multitude of ways. Something should be pointed here, just a random thing. Socrates says his great wisdom, and he is one of the greatest of philosophers and revered that way, although controversial in Greece and Athens. He says that 2 women taught him everything he knows. Oddly enough, 2 women here help Zeus, and Greece is not a very female-friendly culture. I mean, Sappho is kind of female-friendly herself, as we'll get to here, but most of the Greeks are not really that liberatory towards women at all, compared to Egypt even, at all. So the thing is, it's interesting because there's women helping out the major males, usually, and backing them up in very crucial ways, which does show definitely in the telling of the mythology, the balancing of, there's male and female contributing, and there is a lot in, like in Taoism, where the female supports the male, that's somehow mystically yin-yang, and here there is, interestingly, 2 women support the man. That's actually also what Socrates says. That may be a strange, not entire coincidence. It may be riffing on a theme. I am not sure. In fact, that's one of the first times I noticed that. But yes, there is interesting stuff like that going on. Zeus basically produces the other Olympic gods as his children in a multitude of ways. Athena, goddess of wisdom, spontaneously bursts from Zeus's forehead after a headache. I often say, so pure objectivity comes about at a certain time for humanity. Wasn't there the whole time with the brain 200,000 years old. That is kind of like an Athenian myth. It's kind of like Athena springing from the head of Zeus, but only at a certain time. Wasn't there the whole time. Yeah, it's weird. Brain was there the whole time, and then wisdom and knowledge and facts just suddenly come about long after hunter-gathering. It's amazing. I don't really buy it. But yeah, especially when we got cultures like this in the midpoint. But the Olympic gods basically defeat the Titans. They get together. They assume control of the cosmos with Zeus as their king, the power, wisdom, and justice personified, on the advice of their compassionate grandmother Gaia. Notice the male-female back and forth. The older woman, the younger guy. And you also find here, of course, the wrestling with polytheism and monotheism. Zeus assumes control as father sky god, but very much like Yahshua originally, and very much like Indra of India, father sky god gets to be king of pantheon, and then gets a little bit more so monotheistic in certain ways. Zeus himself, of course, remained a polytheistic kind of lecherous, kind of passionate guy, which is exactly why Heraclitus says anybody who thinks Zeus is a guy who goes around screwing around with everybody is probably not smart enough to understand the purity and wonderfulness of the gods. So he's saying Homer and Hesiod are jerks. What is it, my buddy? They're not that bad. How you doing, pal? All right, we have a temporary cat problem, but it's all right. What's the deal? Can't play now, buddy. I got stuff to do. Yes. All right. So, poetry was was performed publicly, as were plays, and also was performed privately at symposia, symposiums, if we want to not pretend to be Greek here and just use, English words. We can say it's a symposium, so they are symposiums, and just say that if we like. They were meetings of all men or all women. In fact, again, they didn't mix it up too much, who would gather to hear poetry sung over a lyre. Again, bring me a small lyre, as Mel Brooks. I don't know, the check is in the mail. It's like, not that kind of lyre. The stringed instrument. And choral performances of poetry were featured of various instruments and choreographed dance. So songs were not just for entertainment, but they were for tying groups together. Oh boy, how are you doing? Through celebrations of heroic feats and tragic defeats. In fact, funny enough, the Greeks, just like celebrating the heroicness of my cat here, the Greeks would have people compose poetry kind of like the Mexican cartels and Italian gangsters. They would have people perform songs about their exploits, and they would sing about their heroic triumphs and their defeats, and they would talk smack. They would hire people to sing a song and talk smack about their enemies or their friend who betrayed them, and it's like, screw that guy. What we have is definitely people were sort of hiring people to sing happy and sad songs about their lives and all the back and forth of random human existence. They were not just for entertainment, but poetry and song, of course, is for tying groups together, as it still is, rah, rah, sis, boom, bah. And loyal heroes and friends are praised, enemies and traitors are mocked. In one archaic poem of Arkalokos, who is the major first archaic poet, not tragedian, archaic poet, I was reading down the notes, a friend betrayed him, and he curses his friend, and he says, I hope you have a shipwreck, I hope you wash up naked on the enemy's shore and are condemned to slavery. And of course, this is a time when many people of many cultures would be enslaved, and it was like slaves are human beings you also consider inferior, and then maybe they're your accountant in your house, because it was an educated slave. It was a bit different from hauling a ton of people, not educating them at all somewhere. Which is more the American Atlantic slave trade. It is more, so he's like, I hope you end up somebody's slave somewhere as this Greek guy. It's also Greeks hoping they end up as slaves with somebody else. So that also lets you know the Greeks knew they ended up slaves of Egyptians, Persians, and others. So Arkalokos is the first, again, of the major poets. The most famous is, however, oddly enough, Greece is not a culture that's so friendly to women, it seems it. Again, I don't know how they privately treated them, but they don't appear much in the text. But oddly enough, the biggest, most famous of the Greek archaic poets is the Lesbian Sappho of the island of Lesbos, which is why she's a lesbian. She also seems like she's into young women and into women in general. And I come from the Bay, so there's women in this town and other stuff who, seem to understand, these sorts of activities. Again, I am decently progressive and egalitarian about a lot of stuff. So, again, I make silly jokes, and again, I think all these people are human, and it is kind of amazing that the lesbian and possibly lesbian Sappho became the major famous Greek poet. Because, yeah, it's a lot of dudes in Greece. It's a real frat party with the symposiums, I'm supposing, seems it. So some of the wisdom quotes, pulling some of the moments of Arkalokos before Sappho here out that are very philosophical, so we can see moments of philosophy in ancient Greek epics and poetry. The poetry now. Don't exult openly in victory, says Arkalokos, nor in defeat collapse at home and weep. But do not rejoice in joys or be sore at evils much. Recognize what rhythm holds men. This is one of the major human pieces of wisdom. Hey, if you're happy, remember that you go up and down. Hey, if you're sad, remember you go up and down. We find the Taoists saying that. They say that is a major central piece of human wisdom for gaining a greater enlightened mind. They wouldn't say enlightenment like Buddhists necessarily, but that gaining a greater perspective is actually seeing the good as the bad as the good. When you're up, remember you were down. When you were down, remember you were up. There is Egyptian, I believe Amenhotep says almost specifically the same thing as Arkalokos right here. Arkalokos may have heard the words of Amenhotep and others Egyptians before that. It's a common piece of wisdom, though. You don't have to have heard from the Egyptians or Taoists. You can hear somebody say, hey, you're up, remember when you were down. Remember, hey, you're down, remember you can go back up. And that would be wonderful advice. What rhythm holds us and holds humanity. Attribute all to the gods. Often they raise up out of evils those who lie on the dark earth, but as often they knock flat on their backs those who walk tall. Which, of course, is a warning against pride, which Heraclitus says is the human disease. The fox knows many things. The hedgehog, one big thing. There was a guy, I believe, named Tetlock, who wrote a book about the fox and the hedgehog, and he quoted Arkalokos at the time, that he claims there's two types of thinkers, eclectic thinkers like foxes and more dogmatic, hegemonic, like one thing kind of thinkers like hedgehogs, hedging their bets. And he actually claims in there a while ago, in the early 2000s, I think in like 2001 or something like that, he claims in the book that actually hedgehogs in times of crisis win a lot of times because people don't really want a fox that's jumping all around. They actually want a hedgehog that doubles down, even if it turns out stupid. People trust people who double down a lot. So, that would be the fox knows many things, the hedgehog one big thing. That would be Tetlock quoting that. I don't know that there are those two psychological types, but that's some kind of that's something psychological in human beings and personalities. It does seem like openness and closure along personality dimensions, according to modern psychologists. It is similar to the Taoist parable of the frog in the well also, is that the frog only knows the well, and the hedgehog only knows his burrow, but the fox and the turtle, or tortoise perhaps, actually know the wider forest and the open sea. So that definitely suggests don't be so much the hedgehog, and don't be so much the frog in the well. In China, well frog is an expression that has meaned idiot. I'm not sure if it's so current, but it was an ancient expression at least. I imagine is one also in modern times. Pain strikes one, then another. Now it turns to us and we groan over a bloody wound. Next it will turn to someone else. So now endure driving back womanly grief. Here, of course, we have a man telling us not to grieve as a woman who's a poet. Next here we have, of course, and it segs nicely into Sappho, who is one of the only poets to write not passively, but actually actively puts herself as an I into the picture and says, I this, I that, which does weirdly parallel some of Egyptian painting, which shows people starting to look towards the audience perceiver rather than look sideways and walk like an Egyptian, etc. There are ways where oddly it's not exactly the same move, but it's a similar thing, where people in art may all stylizedly be like, well, it. And at some point somebody starts saying a poem about, well, I, this, and that. And of course people already say that in common speech, but if it's a stylized poem, they may not think to include themselves much, or that may be a strange thing to do at the time. Again, we don't have a lot of poets recorded, so it can be, and people, this was the beginning of these poems being written down, so it's hard to know, again. So Sappho's history, again, makes her essentially the most famous lesbian, and it is because her poetry speaks erotically of other women, or seems to, that while the men of Lesbos were as much lesbians as Sappho was, in that they're of the island of Lesbos, The female homosexual community, of course, is decently bearing that name. I'm in Berkeley here. Oakland has been somewhat of a famous, just to the south, is somewhat famous for lesbian community. I've never been highly involved in the lesbian community, believe it or not. But having a lot of friends and coworkers and everything, of course, I do find it interesting as a Bay Area straight white dude that definitely gay men definitely celebrate Greek culture in certain ways. And, lesbians are into Sappho somewhat. I don't know how much they make out of Sappho all the time. Yeah, but essentially that is interesting. And of course, that is because, as we will get into with some of the works of Plato, homosexuality was sort of a thing, but also somewhat on the hush-hush. What it does seem like, and this is something that you can find debated, but it is worth mentioning briefly here, it does seem like Sappho is talking about young women and women she associates in very loving and affectionate terms. And it seems like some men are praising their fellow men as really, really, really beautiful, amazing men. Now, experts still debate. We do have homosexual practices on pottery and artwork. So it does seem, and when it gets to the Theaetetus dialogue of Plato, Socrates is specifically saying, well, let's have these oiled up boys sit down beside us. But there's nothing erotic here. They're beautiful boys, but it's nothing sexual at all. It's purely philosophical. And he may be making jokes while then going on to not have sex with anybody and just be all philosophical, as Socrates likes to do, claiming he's ugly and he's wise and he's not really sexual or something. Which we'll get to all that through Plato. But basically, it does seem like at the time, as it has been in some cultures, that older men and women sometimes got it on with younger men and women, but it would be very rare as far as the homosexual community celebrating Greece today. It should be pointed out, without me trying to give or take anybody's culture away from them in the slightest, that the Greeks would probably not have openly smiled upon women loving women in open adult relationships, or men loving men in open adult relationships, would probably be seriously frowned upon. In fact, sometimes I believe was punished by death, or that was the law, whether or not it was practiced. In the same time, it was sometimes illegal to masturbate. So, it's like some guys in November are on the internet. Point is that basically, it is that the Greeks seem decently involved with homosexuality, and there is stuff where it's somewhat accepted, especially in military cultures, where younger and older men sometimes when they're lonely get it on, which is a weird thing, but is somewhat, even samurai culture, it's been said, and other things. But, again, aside from that, this is actually, I am a fan of us being egalitarian today and of us accepting homosexuality as perfectly fine and legal. I know that everybody is not on that page, but I certainly am. This is admittedly something where the Greeks are into homosexuality, but they're sort of not officially about it. So here, even then, you could imagine Sappho isn't lesbian in our modern way, but people have claimed so, and she does talk a lot about women. So that's the whole truth as far as I know it, and there's nothing really else to say, other than eventually we'll get to the Theaetetus and be talking about oiled up younger men, and how that's sexy, sort of, to Socrates. Again, yeah, there's nothing to say other than go right through it, and I try not to make the worst jokes about it, or only make jokes that are supportive to everybody and feel like I'm decently helping everybody be safe, which is hard, because yeesh. But yeah, the men would praise other men as desirable, and women praise women, but this could also be wedding toast. They're like, my friend's a great piece of... It's like, is that them thinking their friend's sexy, or is that them thinking, hey, you really landed a good one here, honey? Like, we don't know, and people have argued both things. So if we have that, then do men praise other men? It's like, well, probably some of as Grandpa Simpson says, a little of column A and a little of column B. So Sappho definitely treasured her circle of young women as her admirers and followers and fellow poets who've imitated her. And she laments, she says, very much like Arkalokos, hey, I hope that guy ends up in a shipwreck. She says, some of my people have gone with other people, with other poets, and I hate them now. So she is, again, griping about her relationships, whether or not they are friendly or platonic before Plato existed. And platonic relationships is actually a Renaissance term, I believe, come up by Ficino, but I will... I believe he's the one who is somewhat credited with that. But Plato has interesting opinions, which is where he's coming up with the term in Renaissance Florence, part of Renaissance Italy. But the Italians might not have... Well, they would have been Florentines, like the eggs. So yeah. young men are presumed, again, possibly to have this, and erotic relationships, again, in ways, and it's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and sometimes in Athens illegal. And again, that is my understanding. So Sappho's most famous passage reads, which is a wonderful philosophical example of relativism. We have, when you're up, you go down, and remember to take perspective, and we're exercising perspective and wisdom as human beings, and saying, whoa, you can argue from this, then you can argue from that. Sappho's most famous passage says, some say an army of horsemen, others say foot soldiers, still others a fleet of warships is the most beautiful thing, the fairest thing in all the land, on the dark earth. I say it is whatever, whomever one loves. I would rather see her lovely step and the radiant sparkle of her face than all the war chariots in Lydia and soldiers battling in shiny bronze. Funny enough, as a lesbian female poet, Sappho is acting very much like a Greek frat boy. The Greeks think war is amazing. They are mercenaries and they are seafaring, yes, they are shipfaring seamen, you know. And so Sappho here is saying, oh, compared to all the war instruments on Earth, I actually think my lady friend is pretty. That is, I do always love, as apparently Heraclitus, and I always quote, says to the Athenian assembly, one of the only records of Athenian democracy in the speeches given is Heraclitus telling the assembly, we have learned to be civilized like others from the East, possibly, again, or he means something like Persia, he means something like Egypt and others. He says, and yet we have not compromised our manliness, very much like frat boys at college. No, we're very athletic people. It's like we're also smart, but we're not just smart, damn it, we're men. Here again, you actually find a hint of this even in the lesbian famous poet Sappho. She's like, I'm into her because she's as pretty as all the war chariots of Lydia. Like, that's again, I want to make a Power Tools joke. I'm not going to make it because, again, but god dang it. It's amazing. Culture is fascinating. And again, much love to Sappho and her fellow lesbians, you know. And yes, ancient and modern times. She is definitely appealing as a female lesbian poet to warriors and mercenaries. And again, the Greeks did not think they invented science and learning, book larnin'. In fact, anybody who thinks the Greeks invented science should probably listen to the Greeks talk about how they're really manly men, damn it. They don't just book larn. Which is totally a frat party. Here again, yeah, the Greeks have some smarts and some brilliant thinkers who came up with some stuff. They also talk about how they're really burly warriors and not really all that brainy compared to other nerdy, brainy people of other cultures. Like, they do mention that. So, yeah, that does give us perspective if we are crediting them with the polytheistic origins of all of modern science or something. I guess cutting out the Babylonians, the Sumerians, I'm not sure. Yeah. One of these things, again, with this is always rant and rave about is Syriologists and Sumerologists know how much more funding they probably need endlessly, and yeah. Meanwhile, people definitely enjoy celebrating Greek culture, and, well, that's how we understand things plenty. Checking on the time, we're about 50 minutes in here. So let us, we're going to end here and finish out this talk here with a little bit about Antigone, Antigone, and a little bit about Oedipus, and male and female symbolism here, because we've already been talking about the male and female here a little bit, and so it's definitely worth mentioning Oedipus and ancient cosmology pairing the male and female and what you can see in some of that, regardless of what we want to believe or how we want to all live as modern lesbians, yes? So yes, the tragedy, of course, and paradox are famous in Greek culture. The Greeks did not invent happy and sad plays, comedy and tragedy. Those happened earlier. They were definitely Egyptian earlier, as were happy and sad masks. But definitely people show the happy and sad masks. They identify it with Greece and say the Greeks had comedy and tragedy. Well, the word tragedy, again, and comedy do somewhat come from the Greek roots, but happy, sad plays like that were actually also Egyptian and were known in the world. And the masks and wearing masks was actually common throughout the ancient world with expressions on them. So we do sort of see Shakespearean stuff, and then they show the Greek mask, and Shakespeare is a British guy who's trying to very much be very decently Greek and Roman also. But yes, that is actually not something born of the Greeks, but often, again, like a lot of stuff, people just don't mention earlier science or art and just say the Greeks gave birth to it, like Athena, sprung from Zeus ahistorically. So tragedy is famous in Greece, of course, and tragedy shows paradox and contradiction in life. People like watching Breaking Bad. Nobody likes watching paint dry or the Teletubbies. They want to see things go up and down like Arkalokos says things always do. So, like the polytheistic gods who don't behave ideally, that they behave like fallible individuals who can't see everything and can't hurt everybody if they want to, but are very, very powerful, much more than mortals. Tragedies show the audience how the powerful and famous rise and fall, and that is what everybody still wants to look at very much, a la the tabloids, and a la the internet now. In fact, I don't know if anybody uses the words tabloid much in the slightest anymore. One of the themes of Greek tragedy is the fatal flaw, hamartia. And again, that is, as I'm going to pronounce it, I've heard it differently. Paradoxically, the greatest strength of the protagonist allows them to rise is also the greatest fault, which brings about the downfall. One primary example is Aeschylus's Oresteia, which retells the story of Agamemnon found in Homer's Iliad. And Agamemnon is proud and strong, like Scarface. Scarface, the movie, which is, again, I would do my impression of an Italian doing an impression of a Cuban, but I'm not going to do that for you right now on camera. But yes, because it involves a lot of swearing. But basically, Agamemnon it does seem like Scarface is somewhat modeled on a Greek tragedy. On Agamemnon, he's proud and strong and allows him to be victorious, but then he's proud and strong, which makes people hate him, and he steps on people's heels, and so he falls. The very thing that brought him the strength brings him the problem. I do like Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, well, once you're strong a certain way, then comes in pride with success. Pride changes everything, even if the strength remains. So, like that. Another example is Antigone from the Sophocles play. Antigone has two brothers who fight over the title of King of Thebes. After both slay each other, Creon takes the throne and declares that one brother is to be honored as a hero, but the other is to be refused burial and left to decay on the battlefield. Antigone, drawn between obeying the dictates of the state and the honor of her family, defies the new king and tries to bury her brother and is condemned to death in the court. Antigone is loyal. She's loyal to both her brothers, but when her brothers fight, she has to make a choice. Which is the greater loyalty? And family or state, which is your larger family and tribe. There are many moments of Confucius. Confucius actually says a guy turning in his father for stealing a sheep is a shameful thing, which means Confucius kind of does say side with your family rather than the state, but there are problems because there's many ways you can side with the state against your family if your family members are bad enough, but ways you would side with your family against the state if the state comes for your family. So these are larger, if this seems like just family versus state, these are larger and larger and larger tribes, and people are demanding loyalty of larger and larger and larger groups. And you have loyalty to yourself, you have loyalty to your siblings versus, say, your parents, you have loyalty to your family versus, say, the village, you have loyalty to your village, say, versus the local king or prince. Those are problems that people dealt with in not only grim fairy tales in medieval times, which many people don't think are the most enlightened times, according to white European people like myself, that people are wrestling with issues of power in all of these things, and Antigone is damned either way. Oddly enough, in the Mahabharata, it's again, I might be mixing up my things, is Arjuna actually makes the opposite choice of Antigone. In the Indian epic, Arjuna decides to listen to Krishna and basically side with the cosmos versus his family. So in a certain sense, Arjuna sides with the cosmos and the gods versus his whole family who are wrong. Antigone, actually, with her family being wrong on all sides, sides with one part of her family against the larger family and state and her uncle, who is her larger family and tribe and clan, and she is then killed for it. So actually, in a certain sense, Antigone tragically dies choosing the smaller over the larger. And here I do not think, and I'm not making the argument, Greek culture is like Antigone and then Indian culture is like Arjuna. That's just probably not even a thing. It just so happens that this famous tale of Antigone has her choosing the loyalty of the group versus the cops, but Arjuna actually chooses the cops over his family because it happens his whole family is in the wrong, according to, well, Vishnu, Krishna, tells him his family's in the wrong. You have to do the right thing, even when your whole family's wrong. So here actually you have remarkably two different tales here that are the same issue, and yet it's resolved in different ways because of the different situation, which shows the same wrestling of these issues. So we're gonna stop here and end with just a little bit of Oedipus. So Oedipus, very famously, involves psychoanalysis and later German thinking And Germans and Austrians like Freud, who is Jewish, using pseudo-Greek words to impress, I guess not enough, his fellow Germans, with pseudo-Greek psychology words, which impress the heck out of most Germans to a decent extent. Again, using fake Greek Latin words impresses people. It doesn't mean you know the history of it. It just means it sounds fancy. So sort of like superstition means standing something on top of something else. That's what it means. But a superstition is a very specific kind of standing of something on top of something else. A bias, a lens, an improper one at that. All of that. So Oedipus, it's a bit complicated. Oedipus, of course, has a reputation for being the most famous mother lover in all of history. The one Freud used to name one of his most famous theories about the human mind, sex, and violence, the Oedipus complex. My grandfather was a psychoanalyst. He moved into Gestalt theory more in his later years because psychoanalysis was definitely losing credit on the West Coast decently. Psychoanalysis still is somewhat, I don't know how strong it is because I don't follow the pulse of that, but it is decently still strong in France, and I believe on the East Coast, much more than it is on the West Coast out here in Cali and California. And so in the 60s and 70s, some psychoanalysis out here and elsewhere sort of switched out of the whole Oedipus complex and penis envy and thought all this was kind of overbearing Freudianism. And actually, modern psychology is a little afraid of grand unifying theories and overviews, philosophical, because of Freud. Because Freud kind of screwed all that up for people, and that's what I have read in history of psychology stuff, is that Freud kind of was a grand theorist at the beginning of psychology, and people are still wrestling with Freud, not Freud. I am interested in how projection and transference, which clearly seem like human problems of hypocrisy, work. But of course, psychoanalysis also says a lot of stuff about Oedipus and others, and I admittedly am not really on board with that. However, gender and how people perceive sexuality is of interest to people. And Oedipus is, of course, violence with the male and sexuality with the female. Violence is killing your father and sleeping with your mother, to put it nicely. And yeah, that actually would be the male is violent, the female is sexual, and that you're supposed to be as a male or a female violent or sexual, but you're supposed to be in the proper ways, and actually as a male, you are not supposed to kill your family members, often, unless you're doing it for the cops and you're Arjuna, and you're not Antigone. But yeah. And if you are a woman, you are supposed to be accepting and sexual, because otherwise how the heck are you going to procreate? But you're not supposed to be sleeping with your family members, and you're also not supposed to be sleeping with the bad people, only the good people. There are ways where these stylizations of sexuality obviously are not what I want to prescribe, and they're not what I think necessarily categorically or ideally exist. In fact, I have a very Wittgensteinian pragmatic take on all of it, but I do think that it is that men are often stereotyped as violent or not, and women are often stereotyped as, say, sexual or not. And that is very real, and that's definitely, we can read that between the lines. So just with that, and obviously not saying women are the sexual one and men are the violent ones, but saying that's true enough in ways sort of that people have in ancient cultures obviously portrayed men as the violent, negative, sort of emotional ones, and women as the positive, sort of sexual ones, and then wrestled with the positive and negative emotions in this. It is very clear in Oedipus that men are being portrayed as the source of violence and women are sort of being portrayed mythologically as the source of sex. So we don't need to go all Jungian on it, and I don't like going all Jungian on it, honestly. But it is interesting to think about what this tale is telling us in whatever terms we like, in terms of female and male sexuality and violence. Because, violence, sexuality, sexual violence are all issues that we deal with. Did then, do now. You can wonder again if the process of any amount of technology changes much or doesn't. And I mean that in the happiest way possible, because we remain human. So Queen Jocasta and King Laius of Thebes try and fail to have children. So Laius consults the oracle of the Apollo at Delphi, the oracle that hundreds of years later says no one is wiser than Socrates. And it prompts Socrates to wander around annoying everybody continuously with philosophy until they kill him off, So the oracle says if Laius has a son, his son will kill him. So the king, symbol of order and violence, will be killed by the next in line, by his son, which is actually sort of the natural order that is that it's sort of symbolic. Of course, the younger order will kill off the older order. That's in life. Sengai, the Zen calligrapher, wrote for a rich guy, grandfather dies, father dies, grandson dies, and the rich guy's like, I'm not paying for this. And he's like, no, this is the best thing that could happen to you. Like, this is how life works. It's just Zen people like facing people with skulls and death and freaking out the squares. But no, this is life. So, of course, the son is going to succeed and, in a sense, sort of kill the father. This is nature. It's natural. But the father tries to hide from this. Of course, psychologically, physically, he puts his son somewhere else. And he tries to kill the son instead, very much like not Zeus, very much like Kronos is eating his children. Let's see here. So some say the play is about unavoidable fate, that choices don't matter. However, the choice of Laius and the choices of Jocasta and Oedipus all bring about the end. So while some people say it's all about fate, it's like, well, but as people are making choices, it's hard to know if that's fate or if that's free will inevitably brings about the same. Again, and that's still fate in a certain sense, so it is sort of, but there are choices and free choices made that enable everything. So people are participating in their fate and making choices. So Jocasta bears Laius a son, and he gives the son to a servant to have the son killed, but the servant takes kindness on the son, hands the son off, and he pierces, the baby's feet are pierced in the feet, possibly to keep the baby from crawling away and force it to die. So Oedipus means wounded or pierced foot, swollen foot, feet, legs, wounded foot, which of course actually means something that could be symbolic of the ideal and the impermanent down here in the world. Confucius says, you don't know any perfect people, there's no perfect people, but goodness is in everybody to some extent. Serial killer might be good at picking locks, you could use that, of course, hold him at gunpoint. But yeah, goodness is everywhere, all around you, all the time. Perfection, utopia, nowhere. The Greek word for utopia is a pun that also, in a sense, means nowhere, because it's ideal. So Oedipus is far from ideal here, especially in his actions, and he is the swollen foot. Foot on the ground in Indian and Greek philosophy often means something like particulars, the material world, something as opposed to the ideal, as opposed to the gods. At least it could mean that. A lot of this stuff, it doesn't mean this to each and every person, but to enough people, this story would certainly mean that at some point to many of them, if we're thinking about how things are interpreted, and then passed down and shaped by generations in the telling of the stories. So Freud actually thought, of course, the swelling of Oedipus's feet was actually the swelling of some other lower organ, and I gotta say, I don't believe in that identity entirely, but yes. Basically, Oedipus is fearing castration the entire time by his father. Of course, if Oedipus's father is just straight up exposing the kid and killing him, why does the kid care that his junk is going to be cut off? I'd be afraid of not being able to crawl away from the hyenas or whatever. The king and queen of Corinth basically raise Oedipus as their son. He grows into a young man. He suspects he's adopted, so he consults the oracle at Delphi. It tells him, as did his real father, as it did his father too, that he will kill his father and he's going to marry his mother. So he leaves home thinking, oh, it's my home, that's my father and mother. So he leaves them, and he leaves, notice the familial, what he's familiar with, and he goes outward into the wider world, and it is a weird Mobius strip here. We find the things with Arjuna, but Antigone, the narrower and the wider of what you know, and here there's a very strange switch around and a circling going on with the local and the wider community, as the local community and its tales and epics and poems are coming together from stories and versions of the wider community. So there's a lot of these issues going on, and we physically know that people were coming together and working out their problems as groups of groups, so we at least know that is a decent source of all of this. And then what if that is psychoanalytic at all? Well, that's somewhat at least imaginary. Well, it is for Freud anyway. It is now. The thinking that the oracle, again, speaking of his parents, he leaves his pride and strangely enough, Laius, the father's pride and aggression send the child away, but then the child's care for his own, his adoptive parents, actually sends him back to the original father, which is a strange twist. He meets the Sphinx, who has been plaguing Thebes with a fatal riddle. What walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, at 3 at night? Those who can't answer are killed. Presumably, everybody who's tried has been killed. The tragedy is Oedipus is smart enough to guess the answer is humanity, because like a philosopher, he can see that actually these 3 things, the crawling as a baby, walking as an adult, and walking with a cane, are all the same thing over time, but he does not, oddly enough, perceive that over time he is coming to think he is running away from marrying his mother and killing his father, but he is going to run into killing his father and then marrying his mother vice versa, on the other side. So in fact, Oedipus himself can get the riddle of the Sphinx, but this is a sort of a play within a play, that there's something going on here which Oedipus is not going to solve tragically, which he is weirdly brilliant enough in the moment to figure out about something else, about man in general, the larger sort of concept. But he can't get it in his own instance. He can't see it in himself, which again is the play of the universal and the particular, and the ideal and the impermanent. Like Oedipus' wounded foot. He can have the right idea. He does not see it tragically in his own case. So he ends up running into his father, killing his father on the road because they come into a spat, and he comes into town, finds out his mother, he goes to the Sphinx because his mother sends him out to the Sphinx, and then his mother marries him, not knowing it's her son. So, yes. Penelope does a very similar move in the Odyssey. In fact, a woman in the Odyssey and a woman in Oedipus specifically saying, I will marry whoever is the man who succeeds at a certain task. And in Oedipus, it turns out it's her son, and she doesn't know it's her son, so she has to marry her son. In the Odyssey, Penelope says, I will marry any man. I'm okay, fine. My husband isn't coming back. I will marry any man who can behave like my husband and do these physical tasks. And then the husband shows up all disguised, and he does the task. So in fact, she agrees to, ironically enough, marry a man other than her husband. But it turns out that only her husband can be like her husband. So that's actually the same theme reversed again. That it's complete. You can see the same pieces of the puzzle being used for completely opposite things philosophically, in order to show people different parts of the human experience. So basically, of course, you can also see like power and like violence. You can see here very much in these decisions that basically somebody who is male, who is violent, gets the female sexuality. This is very much like Westerns and horror movies, although they're conflicting in what they do. If you are sexual in the wrong way with the wrong person, or you are violent in the wrong way with the wrong person, you're a bad guy or a bad woman. And if you are sexual or violent with the right person in the right way, you get the sex and you get the right violence, and you get to be violent and sexual. And there's a lot of stuff like that in Westerns and horror movies. That if you are male or female, if you do the right or wrong violence or sex, and of course people mix it up with strange anime girls with crazy guns and stuff, that the wrong kind of violence and sex is punished by the end. Here again, if you think we're not as superstitious or like primitive, think about it, and it very much is true. I've seen something like that recently. How if somebody does something wrong, it's very artsy to like not bring them to justice by the end. That in most cookie cutter stuff, at least, unless it's a real weird art film, most stuff is brought to justice by the end of an episode or a movie. If somebody touches somebody inappropriately or somebody looks at somebody leeringly, that person is often brought low. In an American movie, if there's ever a corrupt cop, it's not ever the police that are corrupt. It is that one corrupt cop who is brought to justice by the other cops and the good guy cops and other stuff. There can't be sort of injustice at the end. It has to be resolved in a certain way. And if you're a white hat cowboy, you can shoot as many people as you like as long as they're the black hats, and then you're awarded the sex kind of in the end. If the woman gives the sex to the black hat person, that makes her a bad person. She has to be dealt with the axe on the other side of the lake in the horror movie. But of course, female sexuality is specifically here open to the good guy who commits the right kind of violence. That is not me actually being all either left. I'm certainly not right. It's not me being left-wing about it at all. That is actually very human patterns, and here we can think about that or behave how we want to. I do think that people should think about whether or not they are male, female, hermaphrodite, of the Isle of Lesbos, wherever. Thinking about how male and female often signal sex or violence is useful, and specifically if we don't want to stereotype people, or we want to live how one wants to live, whether you want to be traditional or you want to be progressive, either way, or you hate one or the other, realizing how much women often symbolize sexuality throughout human culture and males often symbolize violence is very useful for understanding a lot, and how reality is more complex than that. And how all these people are struggling in certain ways with these texts, with ancient wisdom and poetry, and trying to give rise to understandings. And then Freud confused psychology considerably in the late 1800s and early 1900s with a lot of these same kind of things. And Jungians are still sort of doing a similar kind of act. And I'm the kind of guy where I'm sort of post-Freudian. I mean, I'm sort of like post-Marxist. It's like I'm kind of post-Freudian in that Freud was awesome. I sort of think this stuff is definitely worth looking at from a pragmatic Wittgensteinian point of view. What that means is these are visual cultures where men are presented as violent in the right way or the wrong way, and then women are presented as sexual in the right or the wrong way. Or even anime girls, violent in the right way. Because again, if an anime girl with a giant gun kills the wrong person during the anime episode, they will get dealt with probably in Japan or American culture, because that stuff is sort of general human culture to sort of punish the bad guy, sort of. And here, there's all kinds of cultural variation. But it is odd, again, and Jung and Freud and Joseph Campbell and people who are somewhat out of favor decently today, we're trying to wrestle with these pieces in ways I just want to present this in a pragmatic way, as far as look at the symbolism here and what's being symboled and signaled. And it is rather interesting, because there is definitely male violence, female sexuality that's being stylized. And that's Westerns, that's horror movies. I definitely like getting into that, and I plan on making more videos about all that sometime in the future, because I definitely watched horror movies and Westerns and be like, well, there's that, kind of very Oedipal stuff right there, and you can really see it. I was watching Tombstone. There's amazing scenes in Tombstone that are just ridiculously over-the-top male, female kind of stylized stuff, which is definitely signaling here's a moment of great masculinity or bad masculinity or something like that. Anyway, regardless of what you want to think about the presentation or cultures of masculinity, femininity, all of that, I think we all should just look at it freely and then choose for ourselves, because yes, that's what we're going to do anyway. So, some people say that there's possibly an Egyptian origin of the tale. There is a Sphinx. Sphinx are from Egypt. And again, there is some stuff in Oedipus where the Sphinx is not evil, but in fact could suggest something like a wrestling with Egyptian forces. So yes, there have been different theorists who have claimed this might be about Akhenaten. And again, psychoanalyst Levi Strauss and some others have made a great deal out of these tales. So while I am not the greatest psychoanalyst or anything like that, there is a bit more in the notes about that. And yes, anyway, that is the lecture on the Greek archaic ancient poets and the background of Greek culture and thought of epics, very briefly covering some of the Greek poets, some of the Greek epics, and some of the Greek tragedies. Just briefly, in order to then have a solid basis for Greek philosophy, as we will start into. The next lecture in the Greek philosophy series will be about the Milesians, some of the first Greek cosmologists who thought about the forces of nature as godlike forces combining and destroying themselves. As Thales, the first of these, says, sort of the early Greek Einstein, all things are full of gods. But anyway, including magnetized amber or something is like pulling things with spirit forces. It's all the same thing, really, in the ancient world. So anyway, much happiness. I hope you guys are doing all right. And yes, I shall see you in the next video or two, where we talk about the Milesians, and we will be getting to Pythagoras and his interesting cult of the sun and math and stuff. So anyway, happiness, and yes, hope all of you continue to be good.